It's amazing to be joined by lead pastor of Change Church, author, thought leader, preacher, communicator, Dr. Dharius Daniels today. Dr. Dharius, thank you so much for joining me for a conversation today.
Rob, it's my pleasure. I'm glad to be on.
I kind of wish it was in different circumstances. I wish we were talking about preaching and communication or theology, but we can't ignore what's been going on over the past 2 weeks. So I guess my first question is, how are you doing?
Well, all things considered, Rob, I'm doing pretty good. I think I have a mixture of emotions just like anyone else, but my dominant emotion so far by the grace of God is I'm encouraged. And that is because although I see a lot has happened, obviously, and I'm grieved by that, I also see in an unprecedented way, at least in my lifetime, just a myriad of people that are stepping up, speaking out. I see eyes being opened in ways that they've never been opened before. And so my prayer is that God is able to bring beauty out of ashes with this.
Do you feel as though this is very much a response then rather than a reaction? So with my limited exposure and understanding, you have a very well-known saying, seasons change when time changes, cycles change when we do. Do you think that there's a shift, there's a turning in the waters, something different is happening this time?
I do, 100%. And I say that for a couple of reasons. I say that because one, of my own experience. And this is what I mean by that. So I have lived in America all of my life. I'm aware of some of the issues that plague it. I've been negatively impacted by some of those issues. And so an incident like with George Floyd is not a newer phenomenon. The response to it that we're seeing is a newer phenomenon. And the way many people are responding is not reactionary in the sense that they won't that they're making that they're giving knee-jerk reactions, but they're responding in the sense of, okay, let's talk. I see things in ways I haven't seen them before. What can we do to come alongside and deal with this issue? Because at the core, it's a gospel issue.
Amazing. And could you put out such a helpful Instagram TV video about staying in finding your lane and making sure that you can serve and help based on your gifts and capabilities. Could you just unpack that a little bit for our viewers if they're thinking, how can I help in the midst of this?
Yep. So I think I gave a few steps. And the first one you're referring to, and Rob, the reason that I did that is because I got inundated with requests.
Amazing.
Whether people on the social media space or from spiritual leaders who are saying, okay, I see this issue. I want to respond in some way. I don't know how. And so because I was getting some of the same questions, I figured, let me try to put something together really quickly to kind of help guide people. And so one of the statements that I made is, when it comes to racism, which is a matter of the heart, and injustice, which is the consequence of someone acting upon that intentionally or unintentionally when they're in a position of power. So those are two different things. I want people to be clear on that. So if a person has a sense of superiority above someone else in their heart, it does not adversely affect that person just because they feel that way. So if both of us if I'm walking in a store and someone feels something about me because of the color of my skin, my life is not adversely impacted. I don't care as much kind of what they think about me. When my life becomes adversely impacted is when they consciously or subconsciously, if they're in a position of power, act upon that and treat me in a way that is different than the way they would treat someone else. Then that becomes injustice. Then my life is adversely affected by it. So what I wanted to do is I wanted people to be clear, like, okay, racism is a heart issue. It's a sin issue. And so although we can try to decrease it, it's naive to think we're going to eradicate it.
Wow.
What we can do is to really lean into this issue of justice, which you cannot open the Bible and not see the importance of that. And so what I said is, injustice that's a result of racial inequality, is a multifaceted, multi-layered issue. And it has to be addressed from different angles.
Yeah.
So you've got some people that have the ability and the resources and the expertise to try to reform sinful and systemic laws and systems that perpetuate inequality. They've got the ability to do that. They got the resources and the connections to do that. Everybody does not. For other people like myself, you're going to come along the theological lane to try to make sure that people expand their understanding of the gospel. Yeah. And to see that this is a racial issue. Others, it's going to be nonprofits that they start. Others, it's going to be, instead of now just sending money only overseas for missions, they're going to invest in their cities into areas that are disproportionately impacted by racism and inequality, or just people groups that are marginalized. Other people, it's just like they're going to raise their children differently, you know? Yeah. So I wanted to relieve, I didn't want to excuse people from not acting and not doing something, but I wanted to remove the pressure of everyone feeling like I have to do something dramatic in order to make a difference, because you don't. If everybody does their part and runs their lane, we'll tackle this issue.
So good. I'm glad you mentioned the theological thread, because you mentioned something brilliant last week about, I won't be able to quote it verbatim, but we're great at doing church. We've been really good at doing church, but the justice side of our theology is underdeveloped. And so as a thought leader, as a theologian, how can leaders within the church not just educate themselves and expose themselves to understanding issues of injustice, but how can we train it within the institution? I mean, I studied theology for 7 years, and I learned how to pray, I learned how to do mission, I learned how to evangelize, but there were very few practical handles at a brilliant institution about how we navigate our way through being people of justice.
Yes. So Rob, these are my thoughts with this. I'm going to speak very frankly here. I don't think that issue gets remedied until the content gets diversified. So I asked a friend of mine today, who this week, who was a very influential Caucasian pastor in America. Yeah, very great, very, very astute Bible teacher, and just a great person, great family. I asked him, I said, in your time in Bible college and with your, theological training, did you read anyone that was not your skin color? Did your professors put any material in front of you from anyone that was not your skin color? And he thought about it for a moment, and he said, no, we didn't. He didn't. And so if God's a diverse God, if diversity is necessary for human flourishing, and we believe it is, that everybody brings something different, it means until you diversify the content, meaning there are people who have different experiences, and that produces a different hermeneutical lens through which they interpret things in the text. Yeah. If that doesn't happen, then your blind spots are never challenged. Mm-hmm. And so I think this justice part of our theology is underdeveloped, because our content, when it comes to theological learning and when it comes to a lot of preaching and teaching in churches, right? It's just not diverse. It is informed by everyone who looks like us, who has experiences in the world like us. There's not enough women. We're not reading enough women. We're not reading enough minorities. And there are scholarly people that are out there. And this is what I've learned. I've learned that when it comes to theology, we can be biased in terms of what makes a person acceptable or not acceptable to learn from. So some of the most influential theologians that we read, they got some justice stuff wrong. Like they own slaves, or they fought to defend slavery. And so I'm not going to call any names specifically. I'm going to stay out of that. But that is the case. And so for some reason, we're able to excuse that and accept their theology, which is fine. I don't believe the sum total of a person's life and work should be reduced to something that they missed wrong. I don't agree with that. So I think, yes, we should learn from them. But when it comes to the other side of the aisle, and people who are like really leaning into justice theology and God being a God of the oppressed and things of that particular nature, it's like the parts of their theology that we don't agree with, are things that we say disqualify them from learning anything from. And the reason I think that's wrong is because when Jesus teaches us how to love your neighbor as yourself in Luke chapter 10,
yes,
he uses a Samaritan.
Come on.
And we would say their doctrine is off, right? They worship at Mount Gerizim and not in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, yeah, the doctrine part is off, but the loving the neighbor right part they got right. So you need to learn from them with that. And so we got to be willing to eat the fish and throw away the bones from people we're not accustomed to learning from. Because, yeah, they may get some other things wrong, but they got a lot of the justice stuff right.
I love that. So I'm going to be really candid here. Like how do white people irrigate our ignorance? And I asked that because I had a conversation, a TBN conversation this week with Bishop John Francis, a prestigious pastor here in London, UK. And one of the questions he asked me was, you know, you've had quite an organic journey into experiencing the black church. So I probably preach predominantly at maybe 75% black churches. And so I'm the minority. And I've come in and realized for me to actually come in and add some value to the people in that congregation, I have to intentionally get in my study, shut that door, and actually understand the culture I'm getting into, and actually understanding the history of some of the issues the black community has had to deal with. Like, I've had that because I've been exposed to it, but what about our viewers that aren't preachers and they really want to irrigate their ignorance? They don't want it anymore.
Great question. You know, and I think that goes back to the IG video that I did about kind of finding your lane and running it.
Yeah.
Because the first step to that is education. And I know that's hard for people that are action oriented, because once you get a revelation of what's going on, we want to respond. I want to do something right now. Tell me what I can do tomorrow. And it's like, you're kind of coming late to the party, so you got to play some catch up. And it's okay to wrap your head around some of the issues. So the things that I'm telling people to do is, okay, I'm telling you to do the same thing a person would do if they're going to on a mission field, to be intentional about understanding the culture. You got to understand some history. And so that's what I'm telling people now. I'm like, okay, here's some things that you can read. Here's some things that you can Google. Yeah. Here's some things that you can watch on television. So like many people have heard of like Dr. Martin Luther King, but I'm telling people like, okay, I want you to read his letter. Just Google his letter from the Birmingham jail. Many people never read it. You know, they know that I Have a Dream speech, but they didn't know that he was being opposed by religious leaders who were saying, you're going about this the wrong way. This is the wrong time. So I'm telling people to Google stuff like the letter from the Birmingham jail. If they're in America, I'm telling them to Google stuff like Jim Crow, which was legalized segregation. I'm telling them to Google things like the Tulsa race riots, that when African Americans built their own communities, started their own businesses, how people came in and destroyed them and killed them so that they would have to depend on their own economy, and the Tuskegee experiment, and Bloody Sunday, and movies like Selma. So there's so much out there now that if people just kind of do some Googling and some watching, they can get up to speed really quickly.
That was really helpful. Do you think, Pastor Dharius, that there could be a church that is 50% predominant? Actually, that's unfair. I was going to say 50% predominantly black and white, but we've got Hispanic, we've got Asian communities. But what I'm trying to say is, do you think we could look out from our pulpits on a Sunday? Do you think it's possible one day we will look out and we will have every single nation, every tribe represented, because we've built bridges or we broke down borders and barriers so that people can be in a church, and even though the expression of worship might not be akin to what they're used to, they've come to appreciate the revelation that God reveals through that expression of worship?
Yeah. So yes, I think we can see an increase in that. I think it's possible. I think it's likely, actually. I think it's going to depend on a couple of factors. One is, part of it's just geography, right? So if a person is in a city that is just not diverse, then the church to some degree is going to reflect that. All right. The other dynamic that's going to determine that, Rob, is this, and that is that whatever country it's in, that is the dominant culture, meaning the non-minority culture, the dominant culture's ability and willingness to be a part of a spiritual family.
Yeah.
Listen to this, that is led by someone that does not look like them. And that, sir, is complete. That is a different dynamic.
Wow.
Yeah. Because there are diverse churches here in America, just the majority of them are not led by minorities.
Is that because I read this week as I was reading around that a lot of Black people will be led by a white leader, but a predominantly white congregation often isn't led by a Black?
Yeah, I'm not sure why that is the case, but but data, what we can't argue with is the data, right? So when you look at statistically what qualifies as a multicultural church, a multi-ethnic church here in America, I can't remember the percentages, but like there's a certain percentage that qualifies a church to call itself multi-ethnic. When you look at the amount of multi-ethnic churches that reach that criteria, a very small contingency of them are led by African Americans. And this is my theory. Here's my theory. Part of it, I don't think it's racist. I don't think all of it's racist. But there's a difference between racist and racial. And this is what I mean. As a minority, so for me, as an African American, there is no way I can navigate American society without having to interact and to integrate my life with the dominant culture. So for me to go to some of the best schools, for me to work in the best places, for me to see doctors, for me to whatever, I'm going to have to be accustomed to dealing with the other race, right? Yeah, but it is possible. I'm not saying it's always the case, but it is possible to be a Caucasian in America and to go to some of the best schools, work in the best places, live in the best neighborhoods, and not have to have very meaningful interaction where I am the minority. So I think part of it is people just aren't, the dominant culture is not very often accustomed to being the minority, being uncomfortable, being in cultural contexts that are other than theirs. And then there is, for a small contingency of people, right, there is this unconscious bias when it comes to their willingness to be led by someone of a different race. Not always intentional, but it is a reality.
It's interesting. I didn't realize this, but it makes perfect sense. I think oftentimes white people don't realize, like, we have a culture as well. We can often assume that ours is normal, and if we step into a different context or environment or an expression of church, let's stick with that arena, we can think that's not normal, but actually that is your normal. And when you step into a white church, that might be abnormal. So all that to say, how can thought leaders and preachers and pastors find a way that it's not just going to be the Black churches versus the white churches? Like, how are we going to take the next step? Or does it not even start in the church? Does it start with structures way beyond our pay grade and the political arenas?
I think it actually has to start in the church, because the church is supposed to be an alternative society in culture. It is supposed to be a foretaste of the kingdom. It is supposed to be a representation in the culture of what life looks like when it is lived the King's way. And when that happens, it becomes salt and light in the earth, and it becomes attractional in the sense, so it's missional and attractional. It becomes attractional in the sense that it draws people to a way of life that they didn't know was possible until the church modeled it. So I don't think this gets right until the church gets it right. Now, Rob, I'm going to say this, and because I feel like in real seasons like this, we need real truth.
Agreed.
Truth and love. And this is what I believe. I believe this is the time for the thought leader. I do. I think we got so formulaic in our leadership models that we did not see the importance of leadership models like Charles Spurgeon, Martin Lloyd-Jones, D.L. Moody,
Yes.
Guys that are alive like R.T. Kendall's. So those guys just kind of got pushed to the corner. And now the model is growth, multiplications. It's formulaic. It's reductionist kind of in the robustness of its theology. And all of that is good until a pandemic happens. And now you got to figure out, what does it actually mean to be the church, right? Now you got to do some thinking, and you got to get the theology right. And so I feel like, Rob, part of this starts with us pausing for a minute and saying, what are the implications of the gospel? What barriers does the gospel break down? No Jew, no Gentile, no black, no white, no male, no female, no bond, no free. And if we are not seeing that reality in our churches, are we preaching the gospel as Jesus intended?
Yeah, and that's so good. And there's no Harvard business principle, as wonderful as they are and as key and necessary they are, that, there's no Harvard business principle that's going to tell you how to relate and work with people diverse and different from you.
Yes.
And so let's lean into that a little bit. You are the king of content, Relational Intelligence. You've got a fantastic book out. I'd love you to, at the end, just share a little bit about that. But how can we be relationally intelligent right now as a people? There's so many feelings and emotions going on.
I think the state our country is in is a result of the absence of relational intelligence. So, Rob, this is what I mean by relational intelligence. Relational intelligence is getting the Great Commandment right. Yeah. So the Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations. Great Commandment, loving your neighbor as yourself. So it's this marriage between my relationship with God and my relationship with others. And I feel like we lean so heavy, even in theological training context, we lean so heavy on the God part, right, that we don't lean into the people part, right. I was doing a workshop in Phoenix a couple of months ago, and it hit me as I was preparing for it. It hit me that this is the only profession where you are not trained to study the people you're supposed to help.
That's such a challenge.
If you're going to do ministry, we need not only theological training, we need to understand sociology.
Yeah.
That's the issue. So like, if I'm going to work on cars as a mechanic, I study cars. If I'm going to work on people as a doctor, I study people. When we get trained for ministry, we just study God. We don't study people. So it should be both. And so relational intelligence is just this ability to love well, to define and to align your relationships. And so I think that the absence of it is the reason we're in the situation we're in. And the implementation of it is going to be our only way out. We got to get this relationship part right.
So here's a question, and I guess it involves a degree and dimension of discernment, but you have brilliant teachings on, make up or break up. Primarily that's about dating, but it can also pertain to friendships. So how do we discern in this season whether to stick around in a relationship that's toxic and perhaps based on prejudice and racism, and being patient and sticking around and trying to educate those that are not feeding us, but actually are taking from us? They're not an asset, they're a liability.
Yeah, very good. So one of the things that I would say is this. I would say to keep in mind when a person is making those decisions, and we talk about this in my book, Relational Intelligence, like when there needs to be separation and when there needs to be elimination. And we believe the Bible informs when that should take place, that there are times when elimination is okay, walking away. So here it is. The scriptures say in Proverbs 13:20, walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. I become like who I walk with. It is that simple. I become like who I walk with. In addition to that, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, I think 33, don't be deceived, God's not mocked, bad company corrupts good character. He says, don't be deceived. I'm sorry, it says, God's not mocked. Don't be deceived, bad company corrupts good character. He says, don't be deceived because it's possible to be unaware of the impact other relationships are having on you, right? So this is where I am. If it is a person with a toxic view based on humanity, right, like racial prejudice, here's my thought. If there is not openness on their part to move from that position, then this is what's going to happen. The Bible says, instead of you impacting them, they're going to impact you.
Yeah.
It's that simple. Now, I think, I'm not saying we don't love people and things of that particular nature. I think, though, Rob, I think we really underestimate how disturbing racism is to God. So this is what John says in 1 John. He says, if you say you love God and you hate your brother, and that is any other human created in God's image, you're a liar.
Yeah.
Yeah, God takes it that seriously. He says, I can tell about the authenticity and the genuineness of your love for me based on whether or not you have love in your heart for others.
And I love that. Just two things on that. I love what you say about that verse about bad company corrupting good character, because you often say corruption's incremental, never immediate. So it's so subtle that actually you can get they can lure you in and you not even realize that you're breathing it in.
Yes, 100%.
And do you think that we have maybe moved away from justice teachings because there's a liberal stigma attached to justice? And yet whenever God speaks about himself in the scriptures, predominantly in the Old Testament, he talks about himself as being all powerful, all knowing, but then he qualifies it in the second clause of the sentence by saying he's there to help the orphan, the widow, the fatherless. Like, do you think liberalism has had an effect on us teaching this stuff?
Yeah, I think people associate it with liberalism because people who are secularists care deeply about these issues. And so what has happened is people who are kind of conservative in their theology, and when I say conservative, I'm not talking about political parties. I mean conservative in the sense that they see the Bible as the word of God, God's church is the people of God, Jesus as the mediator between God and man. That's what I mean. And so I think people, I think in America, in terms of like kind of that evangelical camp, this is just history. They've got that part wrong. They've never gotten it right. For the most part. They were on the wrong side of history when it came to this. So you can go back, you can go way back to centuries before. And so justice teaching, even before it was liberal conservative, it was called like the social gospel.
Yes.
And people pushed back against it then, So I think what has happened is there's been the creation of what Kevin Gerald calls a dumb dichotomy, where it's like righteousness or justice, right? And Amos 5:24 says it's both. It's righteousness and justice. And I just think many with biblical worldviews have just allowed secularists to have the justice issue. And so they've divorced themselves from it because they don't want to be attached to something, whatever they would call it, not realizing that you're divorcing yourself from a vital part of ministry that impacts your witness in the earth.
So good. Penultimate question, Pastor Dharius, and I get it's a heavy question, but it's a much needed question. How much should the white community be taking corporate responsibility for what's going on? I hear a lot, I'm not racist, but that doesn't negate the necessity to really stand up for the lost and the broken. Very quickly, just for theologically, we read about Achan in Joshua when he plunders what God told him to leave, and his whole family's stoned because they're connected to Achan. And then in Daniel 9, he takes it a step further. He actually prays for his ancestors' sins, even though he didn't sin himself. And then finally in the New Testament, Paul in Romans 5 says, actually, we are sinful because of what Adam and Eve did, just our ancestors being connected to them. There's this corporate responsibility. So I see theologically and scripturally there's this sense in which we are needing to take corporate responsibility. Do you agree with that, or is it a bit far-fetched? Is it not everyone's responsibility and fault?
So this is what I'll say. I see how some people come to that conclusion. Because I would almost say, for a Christian, it's kind of hard to accept Jesus's work without acknowledging you're the consequence of Adam's sin.
Yeah.
So like, we're all affected by what generations did before us. And Jesus comes and he takes responsibility for fixing something he didn't break. So this is what I found, though, because I'm a pragmatist, Rob. I found that even though that's the case, it often creates such defensiveness that it gets in the way of us remedying the issue. So for me, I move past, I don't fight that fight.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I say, okay, let's not talk about who broke it. Who's responsible for breaking it, right? So there are some facts in terms of, we go back in history. We know who did that. But if someone's living currently, say, I didn't do that. I wasn't back then. I didn't contribute to that. All right. So let's say, we don't have to say we're not going to argue about whether or not you should take responsibility for breaking it. Our question is now, are you going to help take responsibility for trying to fix it? Are you going to join your African brothers and sisters or your people of color who have been fighting this fight for centuries? Are you going to come alongside them and to help remedy this issue? So that, for me, is the larger question.
Such an amazing answer. Wow. Final question, Pastor Dharius, and then just let us know how we can find out more about your ministry and follow what you're up to. It's that famous John Maxwell question, but I think it's quite apropos for what we're talking about. There are many things you know that our viewers won't know that you probably think they need to know in the midst of this pandemic and in the midst of this season of prejudice. What would you want them to know during this time, and how can they act on that?
Well, this is what I would say. I would just remind them that, number one, and this is more pandemic related, okay, that this is a great inconvenience, but it is also a great opportunity for a reset.
Yes.
And so how you steward this moment will determine whether or not it is just an inconvenience that destroyed your life, or it was an opportunity for you to develop in a way that you wouldn't have developed without this. So my encouragement regarding the pandemic is, listen, don't come out of Egypt and not have any gold. Like, come out richer, come out more valuable, come out better. Like, when I say richer, I mean come out a better person, clearer vision and perspective. That's my encouragement and challenge on that front, right? Okay. On the other front, when it comes to racism and injustice and systemic and implicit bias, I would say this, that God encourages a just and equitable society, not just because it's the right thing, but because it's the best thing. Mm. And when you violate the Creator's design, you experience what the Creator was trying to protect you from when he designed it that way in the first place. So at some point, when people are not treated equitably, society experiences what God's trying to protect society from when he designed it the way he designed it in the first place. So not to change is going to be much more destructive than changing is.
I love that. Wow. And your heart, Pastor Dharius, as we finish now, is change and transformation, and you've given your life and are giving your life to pastoring people to a place of transformation, but you're also committed to providing content that facilitates that. So if someone's watching this and they're either watching you for the first time or they want to find out more about you, where can they find you and what resources can they pick up in this season?
Yep. So the best place right now is going to be a few places, and they're all digital platforms. The first is my website, DariusDaniels.com. And that's kind of a funnel that leads them to the places where we're distributing content. We got something really huge that I'm working on that I can't release just yet, that we believe is really going to be revolutionary in terms of the way we're able to release content to people. Because that's part of my calling. It is to produce transformational resources. And so I think that's important. You know, I hear a lot of people say now, oh, we got more resources than we'll ever need and things of that particular nature. And what I'm seeing is people don't realize and recognize that the scriptures say people perish, man, because of a lack of knowledge. Yeah, there can never be enough, you know. So the point that I'm making is there'sthings.com will lead you to Instagram, and I'm giving content on every platform I got, whether it's Instagram or Facebook or YouTube. That's part of my calling, is to resource the body. And if they meet me on any of those spaces, they'll be able to experience that.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Pastor Dharius. Pray blessing over you and your family as you've probably come through this pandemic. And thank you for serving us and giving us your time today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, my friend.
Lots of love. Thanks.